This is Kim Hammer, pastor, Saline Baptist Church, Community of Tull, with your daily devotion taken from the book of Numbers chapter 25 and 26. To finish up Numbers chapter 25, I wanted to draw your attention to 2 points. It's dealing with sexual immorality, as we talked about yesterday. And the thing I wanted to point out, or 2 things I wanted to point out, was that God went to great length to honor the individual that stood up against the act of sexual immorality that was being conducted in front of Moses, in front of the family of the man that was committing it, and also in front of all the people that were before the tabernacle expressing their grief and remorse for their sins, as they'd seen 23,000 of their fellow Israelites called accountable for their actions of sexual immorality. And God went to great length to identify that there was a person who was bold enough to stand out and to come out from among the crowd and hold accountable those that were contributing to the downfall of the nation. I believe today that God wants to bless and God wants to commend those that are bold enough to stand up against sexual immorality today and the effects that it's having on this great nation. And in Numbers chapter 25 and verse 13, God gave a blessing to that man and to his family, for he said, "He and his descendants will have a covenant of a lasting priesthood, because he was zealous for the honor of his God and made an atonement for the Israelites." 2 key components you want to notice out of that verse. Number 1, he was zealous for the honor of his God. And that's what God wants today out of his people. God wants people that are going to be zealous for him, not zealous for sexual immoral acts or anything that would lead away from an allegiance to him in the way of following a false God that is going to deliver a false hope and just lead to nothing but a pathway of disappointment littered throughout their past actions. What God wants are people who are willing to be zealous to stand up for him against anything that would bring down his nation or that would infect his nation, especially in the area of sexual immorality, of which is a rampage today in our nation when you look at the pornography and the use of children or the use of women or men in any pornographic type method, or you look at the human trafficking that is going on. God wants people that are going to be bold enough to stand up against it and speak out against it, because he knows that that is something that will bring a nation down, especially when it leads a nation away from him and to the worship of false gods that are intended to satisfy the flesh. The second thing that God commended about this individual that he gave the special recognition to was that he wanted to make an atonement for his nation. He wanted to seek a forgiveness for his nation because he knew that his nation had gone away from God. And God is looking to bless those that are willing to do what it takes in order to make an atonement for a nation that has turned its back on God in order to satisfy itself through sexual immorality. The second thing I want you to notice is that God went to great length to record in his word for all eternity the name of the Israelite man and the Moabite woman who committed the act of sexual immorality in front of Moses and the nation of Israel as they were mourning the loss of those that were called accountable for their actions. And there is something to be said for calling out the name of those that are utilizing sexual immorality for the personal satisfaction of their flesh, because it is a detriment against the nation. God utilized it as a tool then. I think it's a tool that can be utilized today. When you transition into Numbers chapter 26, this is where God records a census of the people. And the one thing you want to notice is that God dealt with the sexual immorality of the people before he allowed them to enter into the promised land. He called them accountable for their actions so that he could deal with that population that was dragging down the nation of Israel from a spiritual decline, or into a spiritual decline. He did not allow that population to enter into the promised land. And thus it gave Israel a fresh start as they went into the promised land. Now, when you read Numbers chapter 26, you'll see that it goes through each one of the tribes, and it creates a great amount of lineage that can be utilized today to understand where the tribes lined out and who was in the tribes. And if you read them, you'll find that there was some very noteworthy accounting of some of the family heritage and who was in what family. But here's something I want you to notice as far as why God counted the census for the second time. Now, since the nation of Israel left Egypt, God counted them once in the wilderness. And this was the second time he was going to count them at the end of the 40-year span, just before they entered into the promised land. God didn't need to count the people because he needed to know how many there were, because God knew exactly how many there were in the nation of Israel at that time. But God did this for one reason, for historical value, so that we would always be able to look back historically and see which tribes and who of which tribes entered into the promised land as a point of reference. History is important, good, bad, or ugly. You notice that God did not wipe out of his Bible the history of a nation that was committing sexually immoral acts, which was a very detrimental blemish on the nation of Israel's history. God did not wipe that out as though it didn't exist. He left it in there for a reason and for a purpose, so that future generations would look back and see how God handled that matter, so that they wouldn't repeat history in their generation. The same is true today, that history is valuable. Whether it reflects good, bad, or ugly on a nation, it all serves a valuable purpose, and it doesn't need to be wiped out. God gave this nation that historical point of reference, so moving forward with a new opportunity, they hopefully would not repeat what they had done in the past that resulted in 23,000 lives being taken and being held accountable for their actions. God did this to give perspective of the vast number of people that were going to enter into the promised land, because when you read over toward the end of chapter 26, you see that there were 601,730 men 20 years old and up. Now, the significance of this census from the other census that was taken after they came out of Egypt was that this represented the population minus those that died in the wilderness over the previous 40 years, because they were not showing faith when the spies came back, and instead of believing God, they put their faith in man, and the result of that was they were not allowed to enter the promised land. We now have a fresh perspective of the vast number that were going to enter into the promised land. This does not include the 23,000 plus Levites, or the tribe of Levi, that were also going to go into the promised land, nor did it include the children, nor did it include the women. So you have an understanding when you look back at why Balak felt so threatened by the nation of Israel that he called Balaam in to try to pronounce a curse upon them, because now we've got historical numbers as to how many he was looking at and how many he was dealing with. God did this also for the atonement of the land. When you take a look at verse 53 of chapter 25, it says, "The land is to be allotted to them as an inheritance based on the numbers of their names." So God was very fair in the apportionment of the land that was going to be given to each tribe, but also to each descendant listed in each tribe. And God went through and established the process for how the promised land was going to be divvied up among the tribes based on numbers. And this is a very fair standard that God gave as far as how it was to be done. But God would not have been able to do that had the nation not been numbered by tribe. And so we find that God is a God of equality, and that he wanted everybody to have equal share starting out. The thing I would like just to maybe finish up on is when you go over to the last part of chapter 26, we find that it says, "For the Lord had told the Israelites they would surely die in the desert, and not one of them was left except Caleb and except for Joshua." We find that God fulfilled his promise. When he told those individuals, because of their lack of faith, they went into the promised land, God meant exactly what he said. And he was going to deliver the nation of Israel a new opportunity going into the promised land, and they had a bright future ahead of them. And as we go on, we'll see what they did with that bright future ahead of them. Just want to remind you, as a public service announcement, chapter 26 dealt with the census that God took. We are in the middle of taking a census as a nation now. If you have not filled out your census form, if you have not been counted, it is historically important that you get your count recorded. Please go to great efforts to get that filled out. And if you don't know how to do it, or you need help, you reach out to me. Send me a message through Facebook. I'll make sure that somebody gets in touch with you, because numbers matter. And if they didn't, God wouldn't have put them in his book. Hope you have a great evening.